Okay, hello today. I'm going to sound a little different because we're actually working on the streaming rig that I normally use. So we are relegated to the on-camera microphone. It's not the built-in cam, it's the Rode Stereo Video Mic X or whatever that is. But today we're back in the shop, but we have a little bit of a different angle. And that is because I'm not using the streaming rig because we're going to be working on it a little. So if I were to rotate the camera down, this is the streaming rig I normally use. And you open up the front and see if we can get a little bit better framing on that. Up top, I've got my wireless microphone receiver. My wireless microphone lives in this case. This is the Audio-Technica System 10. So it's got a little receiver pack, or transmitter pack, and these are the receivers. And my lavalier mic. But, as you can see, it's not plugged in or turned on. Nice thing about this, in an installed scenario, is I could have this sitting in a room somewhere else, and obviously it's wireless and it'll go, but I can also eject the transmitter or the receiver and just use a Cat5 cable to move the receiver wherever I want to go. So it actually has a screw hole on it so I could put it on a tripod. It's got a little wall mount thing that you can put it in. And you can do multiples. Thanks for hosting, Arctic White Fang. Down below is my normal audio interface. I have 3 of these in the studio and 1 in the mobile setup. This is the Roland Octacapture. Has 8 analog inputs and some outputs, which I barely use. You know, a headphone jack, but cool thing about it is it has a beautiful LCD on the front. It's monochrome, but you can make all your adjustments on here, get phantom power for each individual input, but it also has a compressor. And the idea behind the compressor is I can kind of set it and forget it. So if I shout, it's not going to blow your ears out. Much like how OBS has a compressor, I add this in as an additional protection for your ears. Below that is this unit, and it's a Drive Rack PX. It's much like a stripped down version of the Drive Rack PA. This is an audio processor. This is only used on audio output, so I'll actually take this setup into work or into venues, and I can use this as a mixer and drive a PA from the Octacapture, but I first pass it through the Drive Rack PX. That allows me to do tuning of the sound system. It allows me to have a compressor on the output side. It allows me to have feedback suppression, EQ, and all that. It also has this RTA mic input. And an RTA mic is a special calibrated microphone for analyzing a sound system. So I can actually turn this on, plug up an RTA mic, put it in a specific position in the room, and hit this button. It goes through a little wizard, and it'll automatically EQ out the PA so that I don't have to mess with a bunch of settings. It just does it automatically. Down below that is just a trip light, isobar, power strip. We like to call them PDUs. And it's, of course, UL listed and all that. But nice thing about this is it has 12 outlets, and 4 of them on the back are actually noise filtered. Since this is doing a lot of audio stuff, I'll actually put most of these on a noise filtration outlet so that noise doesn't come across. Bottom panel is actually a blanker because this is a roll-around case, and this covers up the slot that is lost from the handle that comes out the side. Now that's all fine and dandy, but what we're working on today is when I come around to the back, the wires are a little messy. I've got my wires going between all the devices, and during the last stream, my camera actually came unplugged a couple times because it's just using a straight USB and HDMI cable connection that's just kind of dangling off the laptop. I stream with my Asus ROG laptop over here. But I've got the power strip has a super long cable on it, which is nice, but every time I want to set this up, I have to unfurl the power cable, plug it in, take the USB from the audio capture device, it'll focus, and plug that up, and that really limits my cable length. I mean, it's a 5 or 6 foot cable, and I really only get about 3 foot of it after I route it through my cable management in here. These cables are a little long. This goes from the outputs of the Octacapture into the drive rack. I'd like to make some new ones, but that's not the focus for today. So I need to get power in and USB out. Another thing is my HDMI cable, I'd like to make it where it's less likely to come unplugged. So I've got this little OREI, or whatever, Highcorn. See if this will focus. There it is. And all this is a super cheap, I think they're like $50 on Amazon, HDMI extender over Cat5. It takes power, Cat5, and HDMI, and you have little switches for boosting. This is a cheap one. Nice ones are using HD-Base-T. Those cost a few $100s, and if you have the need or the money, I definitely recommend one of those. But for this, I'm only putting on like a 25 foot, 30 foot cable, and 10 meters thereabouts to take the video from the camera to the rack, which then goes into a capture card and into the laptop. So I don't have all the parts I need to do everything I want to do today, but I figured I'd at least get started. Now on the back we do have these holes, and for those of you that aren't familiar, this is what's called a 5U rack. 5U means it has 5 rack spaces. U just means rack space or units. And your racks come in a few different flavors. For the most part, they are all the same measure in height and width. It's 19 inches wide, and it's like 1.56 inches tall, or something along those lines. But on your rails, which is what you actually attach things to, you either have threaded, i.e. tapped holes that you put your rack screws into that attach things, or you have these big holes here, which are a little bit more flexible, but they're also a little bit more of a pain because you have to have the appropriate cage nut hardware. And of course, this is not an appropriate cage nut, but all this is a nut that's captured in a little metal bracket that would snap into the hole. Now these are round holes. This cage nut is intended for square holes, but that should be fine. I just have to go over to my parts bin. And I've got a different one here. And I'll zoom in on these in a moment and show you what I'm talking about. But this is a different style, and it just clips into place on the rack like that. So let's zoom in, see if we can get this to actually show you what I'm talking about. Please focus. There we go. So this is the square one. And you can see it's got the little nut in there. And it's just loose. But it's got this metal bracket on there to hold it. But these things are intended for a square one, hence why it's all square. This one here, there we go. It's a bit more complex metal bending in some ways, but not entirely. The nut is back here, and it's actually slitted on the sides to go into the metal. And if you look at the back, it's intended to go into a round cage nut. So all I do is I put the nut on the back and slide it on. And they don't come off easy. You actually have to use a screwdriver or something to kind of pry it off. Or if you have fingernails, that sometimes works if you're willing to risk your nails. I kind of push it forward, get the screwdriver under there, and it'll twist off. So what we're going to do for this is build a panel that's going to accept power, USB, and Ethernet. And I had this panel sitting around, and it's 1 U tall, and it's got all these RJ45s in it. These are made by Nutric, and Nutric is one of the better connector manufacturers. SwitchCon is another decent one, and then you have a bunch of other ones that are basically the same. We do have one USB here, but these are basically what they call EtherCon, and they actually sell a special connector that goes into this that latches and locks in place so your cable doesn't come out easy, and they just pass through to Ethernet on the back. And then this panel is nice in that it has these tie-down points. So we're going to come around to the workbench, the electronics workbench, and zoom out a little. And first thing I'm going to do is just remove all these connectors. It's going to leave a bunch of holes, but that's fine. This isn't really intended to be a showpiece. I'm the only person that's going to be using this. So I'm not too worried about it looking flashy. I may put some blankers in it after I get this done. But essentially all we need to do is each one is held in place by 2 screws. See if I can get a better angle. Yeah. Take those screws out. And you see they just fall out of place. Some of these actually have nuts retaining them, so I'll grab some pliers. Now I highly suggest that you save your screws after this, because these are annoying tiny little screws. And I'm at a decent point where I can actually start pulling some of this off. And I've got a magnetic parts tray here to hold my screws so that they don't roll away. I'll keep these connectors because they're still good, it's just I don't need them in this panel. And I've built a lot of these panels over the years. And while I'm doing this, you're going to note that I don't put all the connectors next to each other. There's actually a very good reason for that, and that is electrical noise. So my power connector is going to be at one end, and any analog audio connectors are going to be as far away from that as possible. This one actually didn't have the metal face on it. That's okay. And ultimately, I only need one of these Ethercon connectors for this setup. This one only had one screw in it. Lovely. Now I've left the USB in because I think I'll probably just leave that right where it lives. So here's my empty panel, minus this one. And when you actually receive these brand new, these are all filled with metal pieces that you have to pop out. And while I'm here, I'll show you what an Ethercon looks like. Please focus. There we go. So it's got your RJ45 in here, your Ethernet network connection, whatever you want to call it. And this goes on the back. And then you have this piece here that goes on the other side of the panel and kind of fits over and makes it look all pretty. It also adds a good grounding point and everything. And on the back, it's just a PCB that goes down to a regular RJ45 jack. We will be using one of these. You'll also notice that all these had these little, well, come on, there we go. All these little label things on them, and they're color coded. I think we'll probably use some of these. Now the connectors I don't have that I need is that these are USB 1 and 2 connectors. Please focus. I changed the focus mode on the camera to see if it was any better, and I'm liking it less, but I'll have to change that later. But they make a USB 3 version of this. That works better. That, you know, supports the USB 3 connector and speeds and all that. And I need one of those for my capture device. You know, my little HDMI capture. The And I'm also going to get an HDMI one for passing out the camera input, so I could do either way. And these connectors, I mean, they're not outrageously expensive, but this is probably, if I had to guess, $100 in my hand. I'll pick these up. So the first thing I want to address is power. It's nice having a big long power cable on that power strip, but I've got to unfurl the cable every time. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to do something similar to what I do on a lot of my power tools. At least when I make them or refurb them or anything like that, is I make it where there is a actual quick disconnect, and I can take an extension cord, or in this case it'll be a specialized cord, right up to the equipment and plug it straight in. And that's going to be through another type of connection from Nutric as well, and this is called a PowerCon. Looks a lot like Speakon, which is used in PA speakers, but this is intended for power. You know, this is a 15 amp rated connector. It is intended for power. But an important thing to note about this is that it is called a non-breaking connection, meaning you don't want the cords plugged in to power when you unplug and replug. So it's something that you kind of have to be mindful of. And then I'm just going to take that and convert it into just a regular Edison cable end. You know, your standard North American plug. These are Hubbell connectors. Just buy them at your big box store. I actually like these big chunky yellow ones because they stand out. And they hold up pretty well if you're not throwing them against concrete. Got a little tester for me to check it out. And then I'm going to connect it all up with this cable. And this is SJ, SO, whatever you want to call it. It's a 14 gauge, 3 conductor. This is basically a nice version of your outdoor extension cords. So this rubber jacket, you know, is resistant to a lot of things. It's got a nice flexibility to it. And when we actually cut this open, you're going to see one reason why I actually like this over buying just a regular extension cord. It's got stuff in it that's actually intended to keep it round and keep it from twisting and all that. So we need to make a couple lengths of this. This is 25-foot roll, I believe. Yeah. I want to say this roll was maybe 15 or 20 bucks. I need to cut a short length that's going to go from my Ethercon to my power outlet. And I mean, that only needs to be a few inches. Doesn't have to be precise at all. I'll just take some cable cutters and cut it off. And I've used this roll of cable for plenty of extension cords. So that's probably not 25 foot. But if I can get a 10-15 foot cable out of this, that's more than adequate. We're going to take this, just push it out of the way for the moment. And let's see here. Let's zoom in a bit and see if we can get you a good shot of what I'm going to be doing. There's my cable. And I mean, this is how I make all my extension cords. It's just that this one happens to be 6 inches long, 5 inches long. So, if this was a long cable, I would take the end off, or the back off, and slide it down the cable. But with this being so short, I don't think I really have to worry about that. What we do have to worry about is stripping this approximately the right amount. And on this connector, which it won't show up on stream, most likely, it might, since it's clear plastic, it actually has a wire cutting guide on it. Or you could look at the instructions, if I can get it in shot. There we go. And you can measure it out, or you could just hold it up to the thing on here and cut it. So all I'm going to do is go back a couple inches, maybe 1.5 inches, and cut off this outer jacket. And I do it very carefully so I don't cut off or slit the inside jackets. And I get it close and kind of wiggle it back and forth, and that breaks the last little bit. And this end will just come straight off. And you'll notice inside here, there's like a paper or some other fibrous lining, which is pretty nice. And then inside, see if we can get a good shot of this, you have your 3 wires and then this plastic filler. And this plastic filler serves no purpose in here other than to really keep the cable round, keep it from twisting and all that. So once we get this off, we just, or get the outer insulation off, we just cut off this plastic, get it out of the way. With this being plastic, it doesn't like to cut as easily as you would think. I've seen it where on some other cables it's like a twine or rope, and that stuff's nice, but as with any other organic material, it breaks down over time. And that's when your cable starts to feel a little thin and weak and wanting to twist. So now we have our black, white, and green wire. Grab the right connector. And I've pushed this a little too far, but that's not a big deal. If I lose a fraction of an inch off of this, so I'll actually hold this up to here. Put my fingernail where it wants the insulation and tip to go. Just kind of snip off the tip and then get the other two. Make sure I'm in frame. I'll take these cut off ends, pitch them, and that's not a lot of material. It's 1 inch of material to work with, and about half of that is going to be stripped all the way. 14 gauge. Well, these strippers aren't really intended to go that big. So we'll go to the junky pair. I need to get a nice pair of thick wire gauge strippers. This style is actually quite nice. This is the style you see everywhere, and I am not a fan. They're a bit clunky and difficult to work with. Now what I'm going to do here, I'm sorry for not giving you the greatest camera angle, is I am just going to cut the insulation and mark it so that I can just copy the line to the next wire and not worry about my wire ends becoming frayed because they're still retained by the jacket. And I actually cut that one a little too high. You can always strip more insulation. Yeah, there we go. It's difficult to add insulation. And what I do is after I put this little mark in it, I check it against all the others. You kind of want them to be even. And if I wanted to, I could pull on this and it would try to just brute force strip it, which is what I don't like about these. Because these blades on this, they just meet up. Yeah, there we go. They just meet up. They don't actually cross, where the blades on this actually cross all the way. So if I'm very, very careful with this, even though this is for 16 wire gauge, don't close all the way. And I rotate a little and squeeze again. That actually gives me a much better cut of the insulation. And it won't be perfect. We'll probably have to take a pocket knife and cut it. But I just kind of do that you see on the black wire, where I leave the insulation on as much as possible. Because now I have good faith that I've got this about right. And boy, the green really didn't want to cut. And I'm going to work on the other end before I put these in the big connector and make it super difficult. Now on the other end, there's no real instructions provided or anything with it. I could go online and get it, but this uses spade lugs. They're also called quick disconnects. And these are males. And your female connectors are going to look something like this. And if we look, it just slides on like that. However, this connector comes off pretty easy. But when I go to the ground connector, it doesn't physically fit in between the guards that are on the end of this. I think you can see that. And that's because most of these connectors that you buy at a big box store or wherever you get them, you know, Lowe's, Home Depot, are 1/4 inch wide. And that is too big for this connector, actually. And I was going to go and special order some and all that. And then someone suggested to me, hey, try an auto parts store. And sure enough, I'm going to grab a red one of the 1/4 inch here, just so you can see the difference. The color coding is actually the wire gauge size, so this is intended for, I believe, 18 to 22 wire gauge, where the blue is intended for 14 and 16 wire gauge. But if you look, the connectors are physically different sizes. And this is the appropriate size. So auto parts stores actually have that. And once I put this on, it takes some serious effort to put on and some serious effort to take off. So I need to do 3 of these. And these are just simple crimp-on connections. These things, again, typically won't come with any instructions. They might come with a little guidance on how to measure to put them in and all that. I'm not a huge fan of crimp connections because they're such a big pain in the rear. But it's what we have. And a lot of times I'll actually take a crimp-on connection and solder it as well. So again, we're going to cut the outer jacket. Just gently rotate it through my stripper. Being careful not to cut it all the way through. And break it off. And then we're gonna, once again, take this plastic and cut it off with some scissors. Pocket knife scissors work just fine. If you have fancy scissors, knock yourself out. I will say the thing I like about the pocket knife scissors is that they are thin. So you get right up close to what you're cutting. And I cut these a bit shorter. Because they don't need to go but a little bit ways apart from each other. And what you'll actually do, see if we can get this on camera, is you want it so that the wire comes right up to the end of the insulation. And then this insulation on the crimp connector, you can see it kind of flare out a little. So I really only want to cut about that much off. So that's not a whole lot of wire to hold on. You know, I could actually grab the calipers and measure it out, but why bother? Again, I'll just come to these. Get my markings on the wire. Make sure they line up. And I'll come here. Just kind of snip around it a bit. Now on really tiny gauge wire, you have to be a lot more careful. Because there's not a lot of copper there to actually work with. So if you cut any of these little strands, you're actually making a big difference in electrical conductivity. And I kind of twist these ends a little. so that they don't fray as bad as I'm working with them. So let's see here. You can kind of see those are stubby little ends. And I'll just take one wire. And I kind of twist it on as I'm going with the braid. And let's see if we can get this on camera. Oh, come on. I think you can see in there where the wire's just barely poking through. And another thing I like about these crimpers, actually I'll set this down, as opposed to these crimpers, is the crimping section on these is up here, which is fine. It actually gives you some good leverage as far as this, but this joint isn't the easiest to move, whereas this one, I mean, that's spring loaded, so it comes out quite nice, but the crimpers are actually down here on this. It's a little trickier to get to, but all we're going to do is put it in there, make sure my wire's in there as far as it'll go, and squeeze. I give it a gentle tug, and that cable is crimped. Now, one thing I usually will do is I'll add a tiny little bit of solder on here and have it wick up, and that makes that electrical connection even better. So we'll twist this on as well. Make sure it lines up, hold it down, and give it a good squeeze. Light tug, we're good. All right, and the ground. And my little cable is ready to go have its ends put on it. So first thing I'm going to do, slide this on. And now I'm going to look at this, and you'll note it has these little arms up here, and that actually works to keep the cable from being pulled on. So if you pull on the wire, shame on you, it doesn't just pull the connections out of the thing. But you'll also notice that on top, these are 3 different colors. We've got brass, green, and silver. But they're not labeled anything. So if we look at this, green to green screw, white or gray to silver screw, black to brass screw. Well, that's great, but it doesn't tell me which is neutral or anything. But it at least tells me my color code. So, black to brass, so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take those little ends off, and as I'm pulling these off, I twist it so that those wires come twisted as well. That one I didn't like how much it twisted or how little it twisted, so I just give it an extra twist with my fingers, and we will. So white to silver. It just so happens that I lucked out that these splay out in the exact orientation that I need them to. And the way this works is I get all three in, they kind of stop where they need to stop. I'll find out what I did with my flathead screwdriver, and I just start tightening the screws. Only in this case, I'm loosening the screws because these effectively have a captive nut on them that gets pushed down. So loosening the screw actually pushes that nut down. And before I go any farther after I'm done with this, I'm actually going to take my multimeter, or multimeter, if you prefer, and test the electrical connections. That doesn't look right. Okay, let's tighten this back up. I'll put the two on. My ground screw isn't laying flat, so I'm going to investigate that a little. But before I do anything, I want to get this tightened. So on the other two wires. That way I don't risk messing those up. So. I watch this. That ground is not tightening. Let's go ahead and tighten this. See if I can figure out why, or if I have to return this connector and get a good one. Let's take a look. There we go. Okay, this one works a little bit differently. So, I'll put this guard back on. You can see it's twisted up my wires a bit. Not a big deal. Just take your fingers. Give them a nice twist. And please focus. There we go. They're in good shape again. And try again. I am very much used to having to do this a few times because the screws don't like to stay where they belong, or the nuts. And this one works opposite of the last one I did, where I actually do want to tighten the screws. If you hear any background noise, that's my other half inside streaming Monster Hunter World. Oh, she's not. Oh, that's right. She's not streaming yet. She's going to be streaming in about 12 minutes. 11 now. She's just having a good old time laughing up a storm. Alright. So, there we go. I can pull on it. It's not going anywhere. Of course, seeing someone pulling on something that's on stream doesn't really make much sense. And this back piece is only really going to fit on one of two ways. You just rotate it until it tightens up. Grab your screwdriver, tighten it on. Now, since the PowerCon's using a quick disconnect, we're going to connect it up last. And all I'm going to do is grab my multimeter. I'll even bring it down into the shot. Put it on continuity check. By nice dirty contacts. Alright, my green goes into ground. So and check our other. So all three have good clean contact. So we can connect this up. Well, this will be pretty easy, right? I mean, it's just 3 wires. Well, technically, you have a ground, a hot, and a neutral. Even though it's AC, to retain your to retain your protection from a polarized plug, your hot and your neutral actually need to be correct. But as I said, this connector doesn't come with instructions. But you can see that there's a ground connection, a line, and a neutral. Line is typically your hot. So ground is easy. We just kind of put it on ground. Just clips on like so. But we need to know what our color coding is. So typically what I'll do is I could try to rely on memory, but I've got a 50-50 shot of my memory being right and a 50-50 shot of a guess being right. So it's easier for me to pull out my phone, look at a plug, see that the big pin is your neutral, and your little pin is your hot. So if I grab my multimeter again, and make sure I get this right. So my big pin is neutral. That's my white wire. So I look at this, and of course, these wires want to go opposite each other. And you just push these on, and we're wired up. And I can actually check that and tone it out. So let's go for our ground. It should be center. Our neutral, which should be there. And our hot, there. And that little stubby wire is done. So technically, I can take this, fit it in my little connector here, or my little panel. And that's what it's going to look like. I'll obviously have to put screws in it. And then I can also take and put a little zip tie around it through here. And that'll hold the wire in place so it doesn't easily get disconnected. So let's see here. Does this one require nuts? It absolutely does. So if I grab a machine screw, it goes through. However, looking at this connector, the screw holes actually have little bevels on them. So that tells me I should pull off these quick disconnects and put it on the panel differently. So I'll make sure my ground pin is on top so I can actually access it. And I'm going to feed it through the front of the panel. Then I'll connect up my wires. I can actually pull this out like this if I wanted to. And these little pieces of metal are getting in the way. See if I can get one out. I think I need some needle nose. With this being just punched sheet metal, albeit thick, just gotta wiggle it. And give it a little twist and it'll pop right out. Now my screw holes line up. See if I can give you a better angle of what I'm doing. So I'll put one screw in, hold it with my finger, take this microscopic little nut, use needle nose plier to kind of get it on there. See if I can get the screw and the nut to line up. Get it started with my thumb. If you don't have good motor skills, this is a nightmare. I'll go ahead and I'll attack the other one. This one's a little easier, if I can find a nut, which I thought would be in here, but there it is. Now all I need to do is grab the nut with some needle nose pliers. If it cooperates. And don't snug it all the way because I'm going to have to rotate this. But snug it up to where you can tighten them both. And then you can rotate the connector because you're going to see that my connector is going to be exceedingly crooked. That's not looking great, but these holes are actually elongated, so I can actually loosen these a little. And theoretically, rotate the connector by hand and snug them up, so long as I don't loosen it up too much, which I did on the top one. But now it's on there straight. Just real quick, I'll grab that nut with the needle nose, snug it up so that it doesn't rotate on its own. Don't need power tools for this at all. And that portion of the panel is connected, but I need to make the other end of the extension cord. This goes a lot faster when you're not streaming, by the way. It's just, hey, I figure if I'm going to do this, I might as well stream it. Maybe someone will learn something from it. So I need to put, this is great, but I've got to make a cord that's going to plug up to the wall and to the other end of that power con. So I'm going to start off seeing how long this cable is. You can zoom out a bit. There we go. Cut off a bit of my head, but that's fine. Just see how much cable I have here. So, my arm spread's roughly 6 foot. So there's about 6 foot. If I wanted to be really precise, I could break out a tape measure. So we're roughly at 12 foot. I think that's a good cable length. However, you're going to notice right here at the end, it doesn't look great. Especially this little section here. So I'm actually going to cut that off. Because last thing I want is a cable that's been mangled. That doesn't look too terribly good, but it'll be okay. So let's see here. What do we want to do next? We've got to put a power con on and a Edison plug. Yeah, that looks right. So let me show you a little bit of what we have going on here. With these wires and connectors. So our Edison plug here is just like any other Edison plug you see. There we go. You know, it's just like the previous connector where I've got to strip the wires accordingly and put this on. The power con, on the other hand, has all these little pieces. And this is similar to an XLR or a Speakon. So this piece here is the actual connector portion. This will be one of the last pieces we put on. This piece here is the strain relief. This actually is going to be the first piece we put on. So we'll start with the power con, and we're just going to slide this on. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and slide the end of the Edison on, just so that I don't forget it later. So we slide that on. It's got a little rubber bushing in it. Then we've got three other pieces. This piece here has the little locking pin on it. And this is actually the last piece to go on it. I'll show you what it does. But then we have these two little pieces. And they've got little grabby teeth on them. And just like on my Edison plugs, how I have these two teeth. Come on. This serves the same purpose. To just kind of grab onto the cable. And on XLRs, they usually will split this. It looks like on this guy it's split too. But if you can avoid splitting it and just putting it on beforehand, it'll save you a bunch of headache. The reason they include two is one is for a heavier gauge cable and one is for a lighter gauge cable. And if I actually look at this, I think I need to go I'm going to try this black one first because it's actually for the thicker cables. I'm actually pushing it in and seeing how it locks. That seems like it might actually be too much, so we'll try the thin one. Now, just like a lot of the other connectors, this thing has little screwed holes that are really tiny and really finicky. But they are labeled ground, live, and neutral. Or ground, hot, and neutral, just to stay term consistent. So this doesn't need a whole lot of stripping. So I'm going to go down here. A little bit over an inch. Well, actually, no, let's go about 3/4 of an inch. Cut my outer jacket off. Throw that away. Put my PowerCon that keeps rolling all over the place in a place where I'm not going to bump it. We'll cut our plastic stuffing out. I would love to give you guys a close-up and a better angle. I'm just not set up for that. And then this doesn't give me any measurement as to how much wire I need to strip. So I could take a guess, or I could grab something pointy and look. So about 1/4 inch. I'm actually going to do this one. I'm going to mark the cable with my pocket knife scissors. Just because these ends are so terribly short. I don't think I cut that one enough. We'll go here. Move the other wires out of the way. That should be enough. To where I can break it off. That one's a little too short. There we go, that's a lot better. What I'm doing here is I'm using this not as a cutter, because the wire's already cut, or the insulation's already cut. I'm using it just to grab the insulation and pull it off, save my fingernails. Give these cable ends a nice twist. And let's see here. Our ground, well, that goes in the ground hole. Push it in as far as it's going to go. Flip it over, grab a small Phillips head, and tighten the screw. I tend to do the ground first simply because that's actually a pretty important one for safety concerns. So my neutral is white. My hot is black. If you remember. So I'm just putting the black wire in, holding the connector at an angle where it seems to want to go in tight. Then we kind of finagle our neutral wire into place and tighten it in. Now with all these three wires in such close proximity, it's kind of hard to do a pull test on them, at least by hand. So what I'm going to do is just take my needle nose and gently give them a pull, see if they move at all in the connector. And let's see here. There we go. There is our connector. So what we need to do now is take this white piece and shove it up on here. And you're going to actually see that it wants to fit a certain way on here. So in this case, it looks like this way. And it kind of just snaps into position. And the idea is that's going to keep it from twisting in the connector. Please focus. So you can see it kind of latches in place. We're going to take this end, kind of push it up there a bit, then back it off. Because we've got to put this weird piece on. And what this does, you'll notice I'm still holding on to this and retaining it on. So this is going to go on one way and one way only. The threaded end goes towards the back. And that's not it. There we go. And it kind of just fits down over that. And that's what the back piece will actually thread onto. We grab it with both hands, tighten it. You're going to actually feel little locking pawls holding this back piece on so it doesn't magically come off. XLRs have a similar thing, or at least decent quality ones. And we have our PowerCon end on. So we'll do a quick continuity check on this guy. So we'll start with our ground. Okay, give me a good connection. There we go. Our black. And our white. So we've got good contact on all three of those. So now we just do, just like the other Edison plug, strip the end. And put this on. Since we already put the backer on it, I don't have to worry about forgetting that. just like before. Outer jacket, that might have not been deep enough. Having to constantly look over, make sure I'm staying in frame. I don't normally work this zoomed in. Cut off my plastic stuffing. You'd think that a longer cord would be easier to work with, but it's not. You'll find that cords and cables both, tend to want to keep their own shape, and the longer and more coiled up it is, the more you have to fight its natural nature to want to go back to the shape it's been stored in. Sorry for clearing my throat so much. It's quite chilly out here. So I've got my 3 ends. I'm going to go ahead and actually skip using that old tool because I have enough experience using these, even though the wire gauge is supposed to be a little bit smaller. After doing it enough, you actually kind of get a feel for this stuff. You can tell where the insulation ends and the wire begins. And give it a good twist as you're pulling off the insulation tip. I tend to work in the clockwise direction. You can work in counterclockwise if you want. And we have our 3 wire ends stripped. Just like the other. Let's validate. The cool thing is that we're going to test this all out multiple ways before I plug anything expensive into it. Grab my flathead. Ground pin. And my neutral. Now before I put the end of this on, let's do a little bit of a test. So we know this end's good. So let's actually plug it up. So the way this works, see if I can get a good angle for you, is it goes in at an angle, you push it in, and then it rotates and clicks into place, and that's not coming out. So if I use my continuity checker and I look at the ground here and I look at my ground here, so now if we were to look at this, this should be my neutral. Alright, my hot doesn't connect to my neutral, so let's check our hot. So we're looking good there. So we're done with the multimeter for this wire at least. We're going to unhook the cable. And feed this end housing all the way down the extension cord. And put it on here. Just like the other one, it's only going to fit on certain ways. Now my cable's together. Let's zoom out a bit, come up. Okay. Now the final test before we actually plug something into it. So I'm going to hook it up here. And I've got this super cheap little outlet tester. It has 3 lights on it. And I'm going to grab my extension cord. If it cooperates. And I'm going to plug this in. And you can see these 2 lights light up. Where the red one doesn't. And that tells me that this is wired correctly. So we'll plug it into this. Brand new connector. It's always real nice and sturdy. And we'll plug this up. And it actually is showing me, hey, I've got something wrong here. Open ground. And from the looks of it, my ground connection here isn't the greatest. I can wiggle this cable. So something in this connector, the ground isn't happy. So we'll take the connector back apart. I'll check my ground wiring. Might need stripped more, might need tightened up. But we'll check that out. Having a good ground is pretty important. Well, it looks okay. Tighten it up a little, and it did tighten. And we'll recheck it. Now it's I wonder if it's something in the extension cord and not that. So let's... Okay. If I actually hold the wire still and wiggle the connector. So the cable's good. So I might have a ground pin that's not getting good ground on here. That's easy enough to fix. Gonna make it a little wider. Bend it down a little. And there we go. Solid ground connection. Just to be safe, I'll probably take this off stream and improve it a bit. I might even grab a different cable end. Yeah. And use that. I think I might actually have one sitting around somewhere. But yeah, all it is I've got to align this ground pin a little bit better. One thing I could probably do is, since this is just a U-shaped piece of metal, is I could probably put something in here to make that a little wider and get more positive contact. There we go. So that's something that I'm going to work on before I really hook everything up to this, because I don't want an intermittent ground. But it's in here, not out in the cable. So the wiring is actually correct. And actually, let's try a little different plug. It could be just those two connectors don't get along. And a little power strip over here. Yeah, look at that. It might be time to put a new end on that extension cord. I'm wiggling that all around and it lights up correctly. So there's one connection done. only took me, gosh, almost 2 hours. But let's go ahead, put a zip tie on this and see if we can mount it in the rack. Then I'm going to take a quick break and we're going to move on to making some XLR cables, or also known as microphone cables. So the first thing I need to do is grab more of these cage nuts. And I believe I have more of those hiding somewhere else. And I'm going to grab some rack screws. And a zip tie. So this zip tie, you know, this panel has little holes in it to attach zip ties with. And all you do is pass it down one, up the other, around the cable, and cinch it down. And essentially all this is for is to keep its weight off of these quick disconnects so they don't work their way loose. I'll do that. I'll go into L's drawer of tools, snip off the end, and it's on there. I'm going to pull my little tester out, which, oh my goodness, that thing fits in this very firmly. And we're going to rotate around to the back of the rack. Oh, come on. Man, that HDMI cable is quite loose. So you'll see here, trying to decide, do I want to do this? I actually want to put this in the top. And there's a valid reason for that. But I want to put it in the top like this. Main reason is it's out of the way of a lot of the other stuff, and this connector is going to basically line up with where the big heavy power cord for the power strip sits. So I'll actually take that and go ahead and plug it in. Ugh, that is quite firm. And I'm going to put the cage nut over here. Grab some rack screws. Put the appropriate bit in my driver. before I do that, I should probably take this USB that I've got here and plug it in. Now I will dress these cables later and straighten them up once I'm off stream. I'll also get more cage nut hardware and get everything mounted rigidly and properly. And that is in. Now, you'll notice power, USB is spaced a little. It's a digital signal. It's not really susceptible to the same interference from AC, but our audio connections, analog audio, will go down here. And there's only going to be, let's see here, there's going to be either 2 or 4 XLRs in this panel. And those are going to just be the outputs of the Drive Rack PX. But we now have one other piece to put in here to kind of dress this up a bit. And that is this panel. Small perforated panel. Well, this is a big one. This is 4 rack spaces. And it's just going to sit on there like that. The idea is just to keep it closed up. So, need to figure out what screw holes it's actually going in. So I'm going to do the top one on this side because I only have the 4 cage nuts at the moment. That one doesn't want to go in. That's because it has a washer stuck in it. And put one down here, which is just slightly off camera. So let's tilt it down a little. Right down here. Oh, this one has a washer in it as well. Don't know why these have plastic washers in them. There we go. Okay. Oh. Sorry about that. HDMI cable comes unplugged. It goes into I'm going to go to sleep in 5 seconds mode. So I just kind of start these by hand. And then, let's see here. Now no one's going to get in there and mess with these cables, and once I get the other cage nuts, this will just fit nicely. So now I can just walk up, grab my cable. Since this is a non-blocking connector, remind you, make sure this cable's or this end's in the other hand. Click that in, plug this into the wall, and plug up my USB, flip on the power on the front, and I'm good to go. No more finagling with cables or anything. And this wire, I'm actually going to keep in the pocket that's on the top of this bag. Now, since I don't have all the connectors I need to do my analog audio connections, I'm not going to solder those up today. But I do have, if we move the camera around, and you can see the messy workbench once again. Let's aim that up a little more. I do have some very cheap cable ends. Epixia or some junk. I normally buy Nutric because that's what I like, but these were $10 for the set, I think, and they were color coded, they looked nice, and they each have a male and female. And these are just for home use, so I don't necessarily need the good connectors. But I have that, and I have a small spool of wire over here. This is, shielded wire, 2 conductor plus a drain, so 3 conductors technically. And we're going to make some XLR cables. Let's get some of this laid out before I take a quick break. Get something to drink, clear my throat, because... Echo, what is the temperature?
Right now, it's 50 degrees Fahrenheit.
Oh,
Tonight, expect a low of 37 degrees.
So it's up to 50 degrees. So that's 8-9 degrees Celsius. But here I am in a garage that's been in the shade. I do have a small heater on. But, 50 degrees for hours on end. So we'll go ahead. We'll make a red. We'll make a black. We'll make a white. And we'll make a blue pair. And these will all be probably 25-foot cables. These other ones, I'm just going to put back in the box for the time being. So we'll make 4 wires. Probably 1 on stream, and then I'll make the other 3 afterwards. Take apart a female. And take apart a male. And I will have a lovely time unspooling and measuring the wire over break too. I'll show you how I measure all the wires to get them to match up to be the same length. But I'll have to start off with measuring one so that I can measure all the others. And all I do for that is this wire has a foot measurement on it. But I usually will take a tape measure, a 25-footer, one of these two. This is one of my fast caps, and this is what I prefer to use. They're just more accurate. And I stretch it out across the garage, all 25 feet, or maybe 10 feet, or whatever I can get. And cut one wire, and then we'll use that same wire to measure out the others so that they're all the same length. At 25 feet, you don't really have to worry too much about timing, but if you chain these together into, say, a 150-foot cable, you might end up with some very, very minute timing issues if they're not the same length. So I'm going to take a break, and I'll be back after that. All right. So, off camera, I measured out 25 foot of wire. And I need to measure out 3 more of these, same length. So, easiest thing to do is I grab my other end of the wire here. And grab one end of this wire. And I hold them together. And if I wasn't doing this on camera, I would actually put these 2 ends in a clamp or a vise or something and just spool out the wire. But on camera, I'm going to hold one end and pinch it tight and then just spool out the wire, grab, pull, and twist. And once you get to the middle, you can just use your whole hand to grab it. That makes sure that it doesn't slip. I'm putting some pretty decent pressure on here to make sure the wires stay straight, stay taut. And I can see already that I don't have enough pulled off of the spool. So while I'm holding it with this hand, I'm going to go ahead, reach behind me, unspool some more loops of wire. I want to say this is a 1,000 or 2,500 foot spool of wire. Something insane. And just keep pulling till I meet to the other end, which is not far away. When I get to the end, pinch them together, and I just line them up and cut it with some wire cutters. I could do this twice more on stream, but I think you get the idea. Rinse and repeat. Now your wires are going to be a big, nasty mess when you're done with this. But since there's no ends on them, you just pick one and start pulling till you get to one end. Keep rolling it on that side of the wire, and then on the other side, you see I flip the spool around in my hand. Keep spooling the other end. There's one. That's the spool wire. So this is how you roll cables, is you just follow the natural turn of the wire. Wires want to kind of, when they've been on a spool for a long time, want to have a natural turn. It drives me crazy when you get wires that have been zip tied or twist tied together and they've got nasty bends in them, because it makes it really hard to straighten them out when you want to use them. And when you want to put them away, yeah, you can follow those bends, but it's much nicer when you do this, because when I have an end on this, I can feed it through the middle a couple times. And it'll hold its shape and your wires won't get all tangled up. And with an XLR, the ends mate, so you can actually plug them together. So this is the wire I'm not going to use for soldering. This one I am. So we're actually going to put these XLRs on. So I'm going to turn on my soldering iron. Get out my helping hands and bring you in much, much closer so you can see what I'm doing. That should be good. You can see here I have my wire and my two ends of the cable. I've taken these ends apart, and with an XLR you've got a male and a female, and it's 3 pins, 3 wires, and they mate together. These fit quite snugly for being rather inexpensive ones. And these are solder contact. So they do have screw terminal and crimp on type, but the solder ones give better connections. And then you'll have this housing. If this isn't metal, get something else. They come in silver or black. I just went with black because why not? And you'll solder the wires onto this, and then it will fit in here. It's only going to fit in one way, and slide down all the way to the end. This is just like on that other wire, only it has a sizable split down the side. And this is again for cable retention, so this will go in. It's only going to fit in one way, or it should, but that's the difference between a inexpensive connector and a nice connector, is this doesn't really want to snap in one way. And then you'll have your boot, your strain relief, and that goes on, and it just twists on like so. The male connector is more or less the same. The housing's a little different because the connector's a little different. The female has the latching connector, and the male connector has the latch. So they go together like that. This one is kind of nice in that it has a little rubber gasket around here to try to keep dust out, but it's only going to help moderately so. Another thing is these rotate a bit. They're not precision machined or anything. So let's put an end on. This here is called helping hands. They are there to hold the wire or hold the connector while you solder. I've got my soldering iron up here. And this thing is very hot, and I can see my tips a little dirty. I keep this up by the soldering iron holder, but this is just a kitchen sponge that I've cut some slots in. Put some water on it, preferably distilled water, but tap water works. And that tip's cleaned up quite a bit. After a while, your tip will get to a point where you have to replace it, so buying a cheap soldering iron without replaceable tips isn't good. This is my solder. It's let's see here, lead free, rosin core, blah blah blah, flux core. Flux is used to basically clean the contacts, clean the connection, and make your solder joint quite solid. So with this, just like the other cable, it's got the outer jacket. This is a PVC jacket instead of a rubber. So it's actually quite a bit more difficult to cut. But once you get a nick in it, it breaks apart easily. Again, we've got fabric underneath. This helps the wire hold its shape a bit. And I could use my pocket knife, scissors, or I could use wire cutters or something to just cut this fabric. Or paper, I should say. It's a weird paper. You can use just about any wire for this. It's just, this stuff is rather nice. And then you've got this blue foil. This blue foil is your actual shield. It is, you know, coated with a metal that basically helps reject electromagnetic interference. And then inside, if it'll focus, we have the first of our 3 conductors. This is what's called a drain wire. Typically we'll use it for ground. And before I go any further, I'm actually going to put this in my helping hands, and we're going to tin this wire. And what tinning a wire is you heat the wire up and you touch solder to it, and the solder will flow into the wire, and it keeps the wire from basically splitting up into individual strands. It doesn't take very much. And it probably won't come across on the camera. Something that you can really only see in person, or if I had like a high magnification lens. There's a lot of good videos online about it. But you'll actually see the solder wick into the wire, just like as if it was water on a rope or something. And now I can twist this and bend it and all kinds of stuff, and it's not going to, the end's not going to fray. Now the other 2 wires are in another piece of paper, just to keep them separate. Something you see very common with wires that have a drain wire in there. And I just pull it off. And cut it. Trying to remember, is this 24 or 22 gauge? This is 22 gauge wire, so they're very, very thin. Can't push a lot of electricity through it, but it's a microphone or a, you know, it's line level signals, audio signals. It's not a lot of audio, or not a lot of voltage. So with this, we're going to strip maybe a 1/4 inch, maybe a little bit less, 3/16. And we'll tin these tips. And if I need more wire exposed, I can do that. But just like before, I'm going to heat the tip of the wire. Clean my soldering iron. Go to the other. And tin it. Now these ends have a little bit of solder in them, and they're not going to fray or split or anything. Now, pin-to-pin consistency does matter in these, but because otherwise you'll invert your phase. But it doesn't matter what color you're using or anything, because it's just a wire. It's from one connector to the other. I will say that your drain wire is going to be your ground, and these things have 3 pins on them. So your ground is going to be this lower one, and then the 2 sides will be a red and a black. So I just kind of follow what the connector does. So I'll put this in my helping hands, and I'll have it so where the solder cups are actually pointing up. That way they will catch things. And I'm actually going to prime the solder cup with a little bit of solder. so that my life will be that much easier. You don't necessarily have to fill the cup up all the way, but having it in there does help. Now it's a two-hand operation. I'll heat that solder back up, stick my ground wire in, and you could see that connection is solid. Now after I get all the connections in, I'm probably going to touch that up, make it look like a professional solder job. Now that I've got that in though, I can take the other two ends and just kind of put them in there to where they're going to just sit in those solder cups. And this is where the helping hands really come in handy, because otherwise you're going to fight and fight and fight with getting it, holding the wire and the solder and the soldering iron. Oh, and the connector for that matter. So we kind of go for the connector that's looking like it sits in there, or the wire that sits in the cup the best. I didn't prime these cups, but I shouldn't need to because they're kind of holding themselves in. And I just want to get it to where that wire and that solder cools off in a matter of seconds. Where that wire is just retained. And don't be afraid to drape the cable however you need it. I just pulled it over my head so that your wire will sit in the connector even better. I'm actually going to bend this down because it's trying to migrate to the top of the solder cup, and that is not what I want. I've actually had to take like small needle nose pliers to hold a wire in place. You just kind of feed the solder in a little bit at a time. You don't have to hold it there long. It holds there pretty well on its own. Now these are not what I'd call clean solder joints. What this is putting the solder on there just to hold the wires in place. Now one thing I did not do is I didn't put this boot on. But since I only have one end on, I can put it on backwards, and then I can slide it all the way down the other end of the cable. I can then take this boot, das Boot, and put it on there, make sure I don't forget. Now I'm going to take a big long strand of solder like this, kind of pull my connector into where I can see it a little bit better, and we're going to clean up these solder joints. And you see I just feed the solder in, and boom, that's a much better solder joint. I'm going to do this one next. And finally, this one that looks absolutely atrocious. Those solder connections look a lot better. Now, technically, I should be cleaning off all the flux and all that, but I've never really had a problem with flux causing noise. I guess over several years it could happen. Check it. All the wires are in there solid. They don't wiggle at all. Put this back in the connector. Guess before I do that, I should look. So black was in 2, red was in 1, ground is in 3. Go ahead, shove this all the way to the end. Put my little strain relief piece in while I fight it. And then, since I messed up and didn't put this in, I get to deal with the ramifications of fishing the actual retainer and strain relief all the way down a 25-foot cable. It's not the end of the world. Red 1, black 2. I guess I could do this on camera so you can see what I'm doing. All I'm doing is taking that strain relief end and chasing it down the cable. So it's not the end of the world if you catch this before you've soldered the other end on. Now you'll find with soldering larger connectors, you've got to heat it up quite a bit more. Now you've just got to touch the solder to it. If you're having to hold the soldering iron on it for an extended period of time, you run the risk of melting the connector. And that is something you certainly do not want to do. And that will go on like so. Before I screw this on, let's validate. Black 2, red 1. Good. So we'll push the connector back in, push this back in. Okay, come on, connector. Feed this in and tighten this on. And that's in there tight. So now we do the other end. With this being low voltage and me having done so many, this goes so much faster than the power cables because I am very cautious when doing a power cable. So we'll take off, 3/4 of an inch again. Twist this PVC jacket. PVC jackets like to break on their own if they get a nick. Rubbers, you've got to cut it pretty deep. We'll take off the paper once again. And I mean, this paper is just wrapped around the wire, so you don't have to actually snip it and then rip it or anything like that. See if the wire cutters will do any better or worse on cutting this off. Now we have our lovely blue foil shield. The scissors will work much better on the foil shield. we will tin our drain wire. And you'll notice I cut this one a bit longer. I probably should cut it shorter, but oh well. Make sure my soldering tip is good and clean. And I tinned that whole thing simply because, yeah, I'm going to have to cut this a little bit shorter. I'm going to take about 1/4 of an inch off. That's a lot more reasonable. When you're just starting out with soldering, the longer lengths make it a lot easier to work with stuff. When you've been soldering as many years as I have, it's not too bad working with short lengths, unless you're working with a nightmare connector like a mini XLR. I would almost be willing to pay someone else to do any mini XLRs I ever have to do in the future, because they are not fun. Now there's my 2 ends. We'll twist them. Now I've got to tin those. I might have cut too much off, but that's okay. I can always cut more insulation off. Come on. There's my wires tinned. Let's take some solder, straighten it out. And now we'll put our male connector in. So let's take a look here. How can I do this? So I am holding pin 1. Pin 1 is red. And these solder cups are actually quite a bit smaller on this. So this might be a little tricky. So you can see with that wire tinned, the connector is so light that it just hangs on top of the wire. I need to get solder on. There we go. And that connection actually looks pretty decent. See if I can luck out with all 3 of these. See if I can give you guys a slightly better angle of what I'm doing too. So I'm soldering this pin here. I'm actually going to feed the solder in between the pins and flow the solder in, and it's just going to suck up into that solder cup. Before I do my ground pin, see how those look. Those don't look bad at all. So now I need to do my ground pin. And I'm actually going to kind of put a little elbow in that. And see if I can figure out a way to hold it. Because that wants to come out. So we'll go like that. And I'm actually going to hold the wire in. Yeah, you might be able to see there. Of course, the camera is really hunting on the focus. Okay, so once I get stuff in there, it looks like it's going to take it. So there's the cable end for the male. Red is 1, black is 2. And ground is 3. All 3 solder connections are fairly clean. They're nice and shiny. So now we can put the ends on. I'll start off with sliding this strain relief on. Put this in. Put that on. And then we can take the end. Now we'll get that multimeter back out and check it for continuity. Doesn't take long to make your own XLRs. The biggest trick is you have to get your soldering skills honed in to where they're pretty easy. Alright. I'm going to leave the multimeter up on its piece. So this right here is pin 1. And this right here is pin 1. 2. Check the other pins, make sure there's no cross connection. Ground. Not in 1, not in 2. It's in 3. Now let's make sure their numbering actually works. So 1 does go to 1. So this cable is good. That didn't take hardly any time at all. So if you have access to some decent shielded wire, thank you, phone. If you have access to some decent shielded wire, you can make a lot of XLRs for like 10 bucks. And these things, once you hit about 150 feet to 300 feet, they start getting a little noisy, but they last quite a while. You know, I wouldn't hesitate to run a 100-foot XLR cable, especially if it's shielded. 150 foot, yeah, I'd have to have some good quality cables, but you know, these connectors might not be good enough for something like that, but for day-to-day and what most streamers use, a cable like this is no big deal. And the only reason that this is using the PVC jacket and everything, this is a West Penn Aquaseal water-resistant cable, sunlight resistant, it's UL listed, shielded, you know, 2 pair plus a drain wire. It's a very nice cable. I just wouldn't really want to use it for road use or anything like that. This is going in probably the studio where it's going to be laid out, and I don't need a flexible wet noodle cable. I also don't need a cable that I'm going to plug and unplug a million times. It's probably going to be plugged in maybe 5-10 times in its lifetime. So I'm not too worried about it. If I was doing a cable for the road, I'd be buying the Nutric or the Switchcraft connectors, most likely Nutric because they make some very nice connectors. And I could use this wire, although if it was for the road, I would probably use a little bit thicker gauge. You know, this was 22 gauge. I'd probably use a 20 gauge, maybe an 18 gauge wire. And still shielded, and with a very soft, flexible rubber jacket. And they make some of the nicest rubber jackets out there that are resistant to acid and corrosion and all that stuff. And that's probably what I'd use for a road cable. Now, let me see here. I am out of Nutric female cable connectors, but I do have a Nutric male XLR. And let's take a look at that real quick. This one's a little old, the contacts need cleaned, it's actually used. And contact cleaning is actually pretty easy. You could take some rubbing alcohol. I mean, I'm just rubbing it with my finger and the contacts are cleaning up quite a bit. This one, actually, the connector's a little too chewed up for me to use. But here's a cheapo male connector. Get it laid out appropriately. And a Nutric male connector right beside it. Some things you're going to notice, you know, the physical weight of the housing is quite a bit heavier on the Nutric. It's a lot more robust. It's much more precise. You'll even see inside there's a little groove in here, where this guy doesn't have any groove at all. Well, he does have a small groove, but it's so small that it's not really significant. And that's for alignment. It's the physical connector is bigger because the walls are thicker. Your threads are better formed. I mean, it's even physically longer and more robust. On our little retention mechanism in the middle, they look similar here, but you can see once again the Nutric is quite a bit bigger. They both have things for keying into the connector, but this guy, the connector housing, is so poorly made that the keying does nothing. This also has a cutout for a ground tab here, so I can actually tell where this goes accordingly without even putting it in the housing. This also has much better grip on the cable. It'll also support a broader size of cabling. The strain relief, the holes on the end, the Nutric actually has a much smaller hole, and it could fit a large cable through it, but it grips that wire and seals against that wire better. It actually provides more resistance to flexing. You know, again, it's a bigger thing. It also has just a better feel for tightening and untightening and all that. It's a little bit better. Now on the actual pins, where the rubber meets the road, pins are the same size. They align perfectly. The Nutric has a little bit better of a nickel plating on it, whereas this looks like it's just been stamped out 15 billion at a time. The solder cups are more sizable, they're deeper, and the keying on this to make sure it goes in the connector in the correct orientation is much beefier. If I had to guess, it's probably made out of a better plastic as well. So I think that if I was going to be getting something that I was going to be plugging and unplugging a lot more, I'd be buying this Nutric connector. This guy, he works fine. I just don't think I'd be using it for the road. In my home studio, where I have a lot of control over things, it's not a big deal. But this guy's the way to go. And this is just your Nutric NCMX. I think the MX series, M is male, the X series, they still make it, but they've replaced it with the XX series. I haven't gotten one of those connectors yet. Eventually I will be getting that. Yeah, this is actually a good point. If you look at the two connectors, you can set them both up on end, but I really got to flick that one for it to go off. I mean, and that is a function of how much meat is in the pins. I really got to be light with that. Whereas the Nutric connector, I've really got to give it a good whack before it'll fall over. The pins on this are just so much better. And it says Liechtenstein on it. Gotta love that. So I think that's about it for today. Showed you guys making a cable or two. Showed you a little bit about the mobile streaming rack and the various improvements I'm going to be making on it. You know, when it comes time to do more of the rack, I'll probably go ahead and stream that. This microphone seems to be doing okay. But I've got to get some cage nut hardware. I've got to get some connectors. And, you know, I've got plenty more XLR cables to solder up. But I don't think I'm going to bore you through all of that. Because, I mean, that's just a couple minutes each when I'm off camera. I don't have to walk through what I'm doing, explaining the differences between the cables and showing where I mess up forgetting to put strain reliefs on. So thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you guys again soon. I'm going to try to stream more frequently this year. No promises, but if I could do every weekend or every other weekend, I think that might be fun. You know, I've got picture frames to build, I've got furniture to build, and yeah, there'll probably be some gaming as well, where we might be doing some Jackbox with some friends, or we might be watching people play VR games or something like that. But thank you very much for watching. Have a great day, good year, and I'll see you again soon.